Thank you so much. And I want to thank the Kunstuniversität, Christa and Laurent for inviting me, and the LENTOS Museum for hosting. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I want to talk in very broad strokes a little bit about the what, who, and how of the market. By that I mean the materials and the different markets and the different models and the challenges they pose and changes they might require, and pick up on a few points that the previous speakers have already made. So first of all, in terms of the what, Gerfried has pointed out this morning that it's very hard to really give a comprehensive view about what materiality media art or digital media art really takes. I also want to make clear that I'm focusing here really on what we typically call digital-born art. I'm not talking about video per se, which opens another can of worms, I think. So what I'm talking about, for example, not an inclusive list, is installation, be it networked or not, virtual and augmented reality, net art, software art, or mobile and locative media art, all of which pose very different challenges. As Christa has already pointed out, some of the works that have been created in the past may be lost, hopefully not. Hopefully somebody will still step up to collect what's left. As an example, works by Edward Inatovich, really seminal works such as the Sensor or SAM, Sound Activated Mobile, which I showed at Laboral in a non-functioning form, not collected, not preserved. Christa also mentioned OpenScore, the Rauschenberg EAT project. So we have, of course, videos of that performance, and this is typically what enters collections. But if we would preserve this type of work today, we, of course, would focus on preserving the racket and the transmitters, and how do we deal with all of that materiality. That is not meant to say that work is not being collected, as Steve already pointed out, or work such as Raphael Lozano-Hammer's Pulse Room, which is very complex, is in the personal collection of Jonathan Carroll, also the Museum of 21st Century Art in Kanazawa, in the collection of Mexico City Museum, and Mona in Hobart. So we have been making progress, and massive works enter collections. I want to talk a little bit about taxonomies too, and the issue of contemporary art, digital art, and particularly the post-digital, which recently has received so much attention, and there has been a lot of hype surrounding it. What we mean by the post-digital typically is a condition of artworks and beyond artworks, things that are conceptually and physically shaped by the internet and digital processes, yet often manifest in the material form of objects. So we have very much a return to objecthood, a familiarity or supposed familiarity with the language of the digital, but work that takes physical form and is much more collectible. So this post-digital finds its expression in works that are informed by digital technologies and network, yet crosses boundaries in the form. And when it comes to what James Brittle referred to as the new aesthetic, which is very much connected here, it's the process of seeing like and being seen through digital devices. So to name just a few examples, Artie Virkan's image objects, these are objects that will be hanging on the wall. They are UV prints on dye bond, but they are constantly being altered through documentation images. So as people post these images on Instagram, as the artist photographs them, as the gallery photographs them, changes to the work are being made, and the work morphs into different form through network communication and processes. But in the end, you have an object hanging on the wall. or Clement Waller's postcards from Google Earth. These are found images, of course. He does not consider them as glitches, but they are very much the logical consequence of Google's mapping software and some impossibilities of mapping photography through the topography of the model. So that's how these images take form. And Clement also exhibits them as objects that are then corresponding to that kind of break here. So what we have here are, again, works that are deeply informed by the network and by a digital language, which you have to know to see what's going on in the work. But at the same time, they are much, much easier to collect. And that brings me to a few issues. Going back to the issue of contemporary art, and it's all art. Of course it is. It depends on perspective. I think for the general public, we should see all of this as art. If you are a collector, a curator, or a scholar, you desperately need taxonomies, because if I bring a work into the Whitney Museum's collection declaring it's just contemporary art, will lead to absolutely miserable failure. Because so many steps have to consider it, so many mechanisms may need to be adapted. So on the one hand, it is all contemporary art. On the other hand, I think we very much need taxonomies, and we very much need to make distinctions. I gave a talk last week in Riga, and one of the, I think, very important and pertinent questions to me was, well, we're talking about the digital divide a lot in terms of digital art not being fully integrated into the mainstream. Is post-digital work creating a new digital divide, where we will see this type of work entering museum collections, where the work that is more software-based, ephemeral, participatory, politically and socially motivated is dropping out. And I think that is one of the really big dangers we're facing here. And I'm not criticizing post-digital artwork. I think those artists are doing great work. I'm very happy that this type of work receives more attention by the market, but at the same time there are problematic implications that are beyond the artists, or definitely not the artist's fault. So we have seen a lot more interest recently also in the work by the so-called algorithms, which already have been mentioned in our talks. So this would be work by artists such as Frida Nake, written as algorithms, then stored on punch cards or tape, and printed out by plotters. So works by Vera Molnar or Manfred Mohr would be examples here. And what we are looking at here is ultimately software art drawing. And I will return to this point later, but again, there are important distinctions to make. So this is work that is deeply algorithmic, but like post-digital art, takes the form of a print that can be hung on the wall. So there are also a lot of questions about what does the artist want to put at the forefront? Is this considered to be a drawing which would be preserved as such, or is it essentially software art, which means it wouldn't matter to give a collector, once a work deteriorates, a new drawing, because it's the software that counts and not the fetishizing of the object as it would in traditional paintings. Websites, once again, pose a different set of questions. Raphael Rosendahl already has been mentioned, and I will return to that work later too. Net art has been collected since the mid-90s, and I think we have also made a lot of progress in thinking through what is to be collected here. Work in the 90s indeed often was completely downloadable. I could just save it to my computer. That is not true for most of the net art that is being created today. It's much more complicated than that. And hosting on your own server definitely constitutes a form of ownership. I also want to return to some of the points Gerfried made. I think it's really important to keep in mind that we collect incredibly difficult mainstream or so-called mainstream works. Tino Segal's performances. He whispers instructions into the registrar's ear. at the museum. There is no paperwork even. He wants to keep all of that ephemeral. And a lot of money is paid for those works. So I think that kind of conceptual practice cannot be counted as an obstacle to collecting highly ephemeral digital art. Museums do it all the time. Yet another interesting case was the acquisition by the Van Abbe Museum of No Ghost, Just a Shell. You are probably familiar with the work created by Pierre Week and Philip Perenno, who bought a manga character, then distributed that character to various artists who did variations thereof. So this is essentially also at its core a kind of remix project. And the Van Abbe actually purchased or brought into their acquisition the whole suite of works, not only by the artists who initiated the concept, but all of the manifestations thereof. So I think this is also a new kind of collection model. So when it comes to the who, again, not an inclusive list, but some of the important markets are private collectors. And I think we have seen changes in the collector base, coming back to Steve's point about also the collector and the entrepreneur and not confusing them. Since art right now can lead to up to 200% returns as a pure investment, we also have seen very different collectors for very different reasons. This is also very notable in the US. Suddenly the interest in collecting art has morphed to something else. I'm not saying that everybody starts flipping artworks now, but there certainly are different motivations, which also means sometimes a lot less expertise about the works. So collectors used to be connoisseurs. That's not necessarily the case anymore. Then museums and other collecting organizations, and there are some really banal obstacles, such as establishing vocabulary. So most museum softwares do not accommodate the categories that you would need in order to bring a digital work into the collection. Again, this may sound so banal, but it is such an obstacle if you have to figure out how to adapt software, how to create categories that do not exist. And this can be a massive challenge, which is why many people have argued for using open access information system models, such as the ones used by libraries, to bring that work in. Another very important point is to create exhibition documentation, because digital works morph in their form. Media artworks are very often exhibited in very different forms over time, and museums have to keep a track record of that. Then there's also public art as its own kind of market, and there are corporate spaces from the corporate collection to the hotel or the cruise ship, which might actually acquire works, and I will go through these in a little bit more detail. Coming back to collections of other organizations, many, if not most of you, are probably familiar with Rhizome's art base, which did not start as a collection, but initially was an archive to which artists could submit their net art pieces. It then evolved more and more into a collection. Rhizome now considers it more of a collection because it is actually filtered. So while in the beginning everybody could submit, now there are more filtering mechanisms in place. So this has become its own kind of collection, and Rhizome is really at the forefront of figuring out the preservations of those works, and is doing an amazing service to the field. Franz Thalmeier once remarked, it is easier to get an entire museum collection on the internet than to get a single exhibition of internet art in a museum space. I think that still is very much true. I also, picking up on some of Steve's remarks, think that we really need to create models and adapt work when it is shown in the museum space. I think there's tremendous advantage to that. Bringing internet art into the gallery does not mean that you have to take it out of the browser. It does not mean that you have to take it offline, but you really have to think through ways of exhibiting it. Raphael Rosendahl says, if you look at a work of internet art at home, you're looking at the work of art on your laptop. If you come to the gallery, you're looking at the screen. Your perspective shifts. While at home, you focus on the work, you forget about the environment. In the gallery, you focus on the materiality of that screen and space. And he's one of the artists who very much adapts those types of works. Another museum collection is the Artport website that I created in 2001 at the Whitney Museum. So all of the works for Artport were commissioned as non-exclusive licenses. And one of the reasons I did that was that I first of all wanted artists to retain copyright in the first place, but also that I knew we weren't able or didn't have mechanisms in place at the time to really take care of the work. So I actually also encouraged artists to put their work in the art base, despite the fact that they were hosted on the Whitney server. So a couple of years ago, I actually managed to bring Artport as a whole into the Whitney's collection. And what we did was bring the works in despite the fact that they are non-exclusive licenses and despite the fact that the artists still all have copyright to the works. So we created essentially a completely new model. And Artport is its own collection within the collection of the Whitney Museum now, but a collection that is substantially different from all the other works, where, of course, the museum would own a unique and individual piece. So definitely a change here. I want to just very briefly return to vocabulary and the difficulties and challenges of bringing in works. One of the projects that recently entered the Whitney's collection as a gift was Lorna Mills' Ways of Something, all episodes. So looking at this, and you're right now just looking at 2 episodes, this is a remix project, and it contains 1-minute clips of all of these artists. So the curatorial committee just looked at this in horror and said, are we bringing in 100 artists with that one piece, with those 1-minute clips? Do they all actually officially enter the collection with membership, with privileges, with everything that comes with it? And that's a real question for a museum. In the end, it turned out that Lorna actually considers it a piece by herself, and so it isn't a piece created by 100 artists. But these are scenarios that come up more and more often with remix projects, and they pose challenges to museums. I want to return to the point of exhibition documentation and specifically reference 3 articles that are included in the Blackwell Companion to Digital Art that I just edited, because I think they're really relevant to what needs to happen in museum collections if we want to integrate digital art more. So Rudolf Frieling, in his article, Participatory Art Histories and Experiences of Display, really points out how much works morph over time. So what you're looking at here is Julia Scher's Predictive Engineering as it was exhibited at SF MoMA in 1993 and 1998. And as you can see, it's a completely different installation because the context for that type of work has changed, and you would show it in a very different way, while still maintaining the essence of the piece in and of itself. Annette Decker, in Enabling the Future or How to Survive Forever, in that same volume, also makes points about different forms of documentation and how essential they are to the work, specifically using Jodi's Jet Set Willy Forever. So on the one hand, artists may use documentation in the creation of their work. Jodi in Jet Set Willy actually used documentation to turn the work into a documented piece. So due to the lack of function of the hardware, the work became documentation of its own process. And at the same time, we also need the documentation of the exhibition of that project, since it will morph over time. And that also applies to the work of Mouchette, and I don't want to get into all of the details. All of this is summed up in Beryl Graham's plea for exhibition histories in order to enable a future, and she just uses Anthony Antonelli's tongue-in-cheek work, Put It on a Pedestal, as an example where ultimately you're invited as part of the work to create your museum exhibition. So a lot of this poses, I think, very pertinent questions for museums and for collectors. When it comes to corporate collections, I just want to show Evan Radel's Diamond Matrix as an example. Sorry, I'm talking about less corporate but more public art. So this was a piece that was commissioned by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs Percent for Art program with the Department of Design and Construction, and it is at the headquarters of the New York Police Department in Queens. So here we have a large-scale, 6 stories high digital art installation at the police headquarters. And very often these types of public buildings are actually places where these really massive, large-scale works can be exhibited or acquired for cities. So I think cities also play an important role in that respect. This doesn't mean that this type of work couldn't enter private collections. The Borosan collection, for example, has a similar work on a smaller scale in their collection. So finally, I want to get to the how and different models for acquiring art. And there are just a few points I want to highlight. One of them, the scaling of editions, which has been a huge issue for galleries over decades. Do we want to emphasize the sharing aspect of digital art and create a massive edition where pieces are sold for $20 a piece, or keep it very small and exclusive, make it an edition of 3, and sell them for 15,000. So I think there are also important philosophical questions involved here in terms of how much do we create artificial scarcity or stay true to the intrinsic potential of the work and for the sharing aspect of new media. Again, not all of this is new. Photography, of course, and video face some of the same questions in terms of pricing and editions. The idea of establishing a notion of the unique, of the original, of the aura in the work, authenticity and provenance, how do we do that, considering that works can be copied? Can we diversify work across platforms, again, to make it accessible to both the public and museums? How do we anticipate preservation needs? And finally, a shift in collection to licensing models. So I briefly want to go through all of these. So in a recent article in Artsy, How Young Artists Are Setting Prices of Their Work, you find quotes that are very much contrary to what Steve just said, or probably what you would consider some of the worst practices. So here Clément Jacques says about Miriam Benani's work, which was shown at MoMA PS1. For something like Miriam Benani's work, it's super hard, it's digital and site-specific, and the equipment alone can be insane. For her PS1 show, we did it retail style and just calculated all the expenses and doubled it. And of course that pays no attention whatsoever to a conceptual value or how you would measure that. Raphael Rosendaal's art website sales contract was already mentioned, but I think in his idea of actually attaching domain names to each specific work of net art, and selling the domain and website under its name, he cuts to the core of actually ownership of hosting the work. No matter if it's accessible to the world, as the owner, you in this case own the domain name, but if you're hosting work on your server, I think you are effectively the owner of it. A huge issue is provenance and authenticity. Artists very often create certificates of authenticity for their works, and there recently have been a lot of efforts to use the Bitcoin blockchain for authenticating artwork. One example would be Monograph, started by an artist, Kevin McCoy, who is the co-founder of the company. So Monograph uses the Bitcoin blockchain for authentication, so does Scribe and Verisart, so generating a certificate and also potentially tracing where the work goes if you want to keep it more open is, I think, something that is very interesting. Another big issue is appraisal of that work. Sotheby's is only now starting to really think through how to do that. How do you appraise a work of digital art for the market? And of course, those mechanisms are also essential. I want to talk a little bit also about diversifying across platforms, and many artists have done that, I think, very successfully. So, for example, Cory Archangel's Super Mario Clouds is in the collection of the Whitney Museum. Again, this is a work where he basically hacked the Nintendo cartridge and erased everything but the clouds, which you see traveling across the sky, turning it into a kind of different art piece in terms of its visual language. At the same time, if you go to Cory's website, you find the detailed instructions, the code, and also the instructions of how to break open the cartridge, how to create the work for yourself, essentially. So everybody could have this at home if you have a system, if you buy this and create it for yourself. And I think this is not mutually exclusive, putting in the work as the individual to engineer the work yourself or having it in a big museum collection, I think is not a contradiction. It's a different mindset, and all of these forms could exist side by side. The same goes for so many works that are available on YouTube. In this case, this is, I don't have sound. Okay. This is Cory's Paganini's Caprice No. 5, cut together completely note by note from heavy metal guitar learning videos on YouTube. Paganini's Caprice is very popular among them, so he really reassembled this note by note. And what you see here is, of course, a really bad pixelated copy that I ripped off of YouTube. But that doesn't mean that this work couldn't be shown at the Whitney Museum as a master of high quality or enter a museum collection. And as we are all aware, so many famous videos are now available as excerpts or in full on YouTube. That doesn't mean that, again, the high resolution master shouldn't be in a museum collection. So it's just a way of diversifying across platforms. Badlands Unlimited recently started a new approach by introducing artists' files for sale. So they are selling scripts, literally, or files, as they say, by artists such as Cory Paul Chan or Martine Sims. So what you're buying here in the case of Cory's Jabber PL is really a 5K Perl script, for which you're paying a couple of $100. So I think this is, again, introducing a different idea to the market. I think this may be of more appeal to geeks, and I'm not sure where all of this is going and who would actually collect Perl scripts. but it's interesting that these forms are popping up. So I also want to come back to this idea of preservation, and I would really echo Gerfried's works here. We have put so much effort into preserving art over centuries and trained people in methods to do that, and there's absolutely no reason why this should be an obstacle for digital art. We have made enormous progress. Museums now have their best practices in place. There has been an enormous amount of conferences dedicated to the subject, such as Tech Focus 3, Caring for Software-Based Art at the Guggenheim, Media in Transition at the Tate. And there was, of course, the big digital art conservation project initiated by ZKM. So we now have methods ranging from storage through emulation, migration, and reinterpretation. Again, each of them have to be determined on a case-by-case basis. It's really assessing what a specific work needs and how to best choose a method for preserving it. But it's not rocket science, and if you ever look into case studies of preservation of traditional art pieces, such as, for example, works by Paul Thek, where really every little twig of branch has to be affixed to a platform again, it's mind-blowing what museums do and what goes into it, and I think many digital works actually could be preserved much, much more easily than that. So the Guggenheim also, as early as 2003, put on an exhibition called Seeing Double, where they migrated works. What you see here is John F. Simon Jr.'s color panel version 1.0, as it was migrated from one platform to the next. And these studies are also incredibly important to share. So the Whitney Museum also owns one of those pieces. So here we already have a proof of concept of what could be done with the work. And I think it's crucial that institutions share that kind of knowledge. Raphael Lozano Hammer got a lot of attention for his best practices for the conservation of media art. He makes again, a lot of the code available on GitHub. You will also find this on GitHub. In his section on dealing with the collector, he also points to some of the problems you might run into among more mainstream collectors, such as explaining the concept of digital copy. So on the one hand, you might have people who do not understand that the original and the copy are identical. Of course, there is degradation over time, but essentially. And others being so completely absorbed with authenticity that they ask artists to destroy the file once, a print has been made, both of which are, of course, extreme positions that have nothing to do with the essentials of the medium. But I think artists are also getting much more savvy at really finding ways of packaging their work. Then there have been very helpful tools created for the conservation. I just want to mention two of them, both developed by Rhizome, the web recorder and emulation as a service, which has been done in collaboration with the University of Freiburg. So the web recorder allows to basically record online performances such as the ones taking place on Instagram, on Facebook. A lot of artists are using those platforms as environments for performances. One example would be Amelia Ullman's Excellences and Perfections, a semi-fictional makeover that she took on those platforms. So what the web recorder would allow you in a dynamic way is to capture this as a performance, while of course Amelia's Instagram account will evolve beyond that. But you could actually create packages of online performances that way. And again, emulation as a service done with the University of Freiburg is a tool that could be tremendously helpful for museums. Rhizome has used it on Teresa Duncan's CDs, so you will see in a second, yeah, here's the Mac Classic environment popping up. It also has been used for George LeGrady's CD-ROM, an anecdoted archive of the Cold War. So within the browser window, you can basically start up the old operating system, no matter what it is, and look at the work again. This would be tremendously helpful for, let's say, the Whitney's Artport collection. We're struggling with many of the Java-based works, which have to be redone right now. So using this cloud-based service would really allow us to have everything run in the browser window again, and I very much hope that this is where things will go in the future. And I want to return to Ian Cheng and the example that Steve mentioned of video art, which of course it is not, as an algorithm that is unfolding in the window here. So if I could get a little bit sound, you would actually hear that what is driving the visuals on the screen is a conversation amongst chatbots. So what Ian uses here is a third-party service, Pandora chatbots, and you have this generative software creating the visuals on the basis of their conversation. So what happened very recently, this work is in the Whitney's collection, is that Ian approached us and said, I want to make changes to the bots, probably swap out the bots. And how do we do this? So here we are faced with a problem where we have a work in the collection that has a dynamic digital life. And we need to accommodate and record and document that life over time. So in the end, Ian did not swap out the service completely, but create two different things. First of all, streamlining the code, but then also using artificial intelligence markup language emulation for creating a version that you could toggle if, for example, the network connection doesn't work anymore. My point being, this work will probably change tremendously over time. So now we have a GitHub repository for the Whitney where Ian is keeping track of all of these changes. And I think this is just something that needs to happen on the museum end to accommodate these works rather than forcing them into a format that simply can't accommodate their digital life and their digital lifespan. So I want to end by just very briefly bringing up the issue of online collecting. Paul Welder really is the expert here and will talk about that in more detail this afternoon. What we have seen recently is a switch from ownership to licensing. A lot of online services that basically tell you that you collect work with them. I think the terminology is very misleading here because you're not collecting in the sense that you own a copy, but you're effectively licensing the work. So examples, and all of them are based on different models. I'm sure Paul will talk about that in more detail, would be Depict, where you're actually buying the Depict frame as an object, and then you're streaming the works into it, or Sedition. And I think what is also important here to think through is that these platforms do not pay attention to scale. So basically you license and you can stream it to your cell phone or to your large plasma screen or to your small laptop screen. So that of course effectively could also ruin a work if you're not paying attention from the beginning to what the scale intended by the artist was meant to be. Works you find a lot on platforms such as Sedition are excerpts from actual works. So you can collect Bill Viola through Sedition, but what you are getting essentially is a 3-minute excerpt of a much, much larger piece. And data editions would be another example of that. Anyway, I think it's a very interesting kind of move and experimentation we see right now. How successful it will be, how it will change mindsets or not remains to be seen, but it's definitely an area to be watched. So in closing, I just want to say that the art market is such a diverse ecosystem. And if you ask the question of what does digital art really need to make it on the market, there is no easy answer or prescription to that, because museums and art fairs and galleries all work together and influence each other. I agree with Gerfried that galleries are just a tiny little segment of the art market, but they're also an incredibly important segment of it, because I see, for example, the whole museum world as very connected to the gallery world. And we have to get digital artwork more into the galleries. In the US, at least, we also receive gifts from galleries. We're constantly competing with the galleries, and we do not have we actually cannot compete anymore when it comes to the monetary level with private collectors who often have a lot more money to spend. So we also rely on the generosity of galleries to some extent. So on the one hand, the gallery market may be a small segment. On the other hand, in terms of this ecosystem of the larger mainstream art world, it's an incredibly important segment. So I'll end it here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.